Who are we? Well, I'm Bernie. I'm a retired senior executive from the trucking transportation industry, former classmate of my partner in crime, Dick. And we hope to provide a senior perspective to people of all ages on the current events of the day, and also some anecdotal stuff and some humor, I hope.
Okay, I'm Dick. I'm 74. I'm a retired military officer. After leaving the military, I taught high school for 15 years, basically psychology, and I'm not happy the way the world is going. Okay, Bernie, let's start off with you today.
Thank you, Dick. Good to see you. I'd like to mention, and you've made reference to Hillsdale College more than a few times on our previous podcasts, and also to the monthly newsletter that comes out of Hillsdale. And I just received my copy of it today, and it features a speech by the conservative political columnist Mark Steyn. And I think a lot of our listeners, viewers know Mark Steyn principally because he was far and away the best guest host for the Rush Limbaugh show, combining incisive observations on the political scene, but oftentimes in a pretty humorous way. To borrow from, God, I hate doing this, but a tongue in cheek, to borrow from Obama, I'd like to have a beer with Mark Steyn. Anyways, he gave a speech in Franklin, Tennessee to Hillsdale alumni on, it was a leadership forum, but the speech itself had to do principally with his view that America is becoming increasingly unrecognizable, and unrecognizable because of the policies and the antics of the far left. And I just thought that might be a jumping off point for our podcast today, which is podcast 6, because in talking about America being increasingly unrecognizable, I think that ties with your opening comment each week that you just don't like the way the country and the world is going. And I would argue, I guess, along with Mark Steyn, that America has become kind of the bellwether for radical change, but in the wrong direction. And as America goes, at least so goes the Western world. But I'll just confine my remarks to what Mark Steyn said of this country. That sound good?
Yes.
Okay. Well, 3 key things, and there were some others, but the 3 key things he talked about at some length. One is the growing lack of equality under the law, which has always been a primary tenet of American jurisprudence. He says our judicial system has become thoroughly politicized. And now oftentimes, depending on who the left views as culprits, and for just about anybody, what comes to mind immediately are police officers. More and more, once the Democratic media gets a hold of a story and pounces on it, and then the courts, oftentimes with liberal judge appointees of, say, the Obama administration, as but one example, or Bill Clinton, you find that the notion, or the precept is a better word, that people are innocent until proven guilty and have a right to confront their accusers has gone by the wayside. And that kind of combines with the cancel culture, where if the left thinks you've done something that doesn't conform with their notion of how things ought to be, irrespective of our Constitution and the laws on the books, then they're ready to fry you. They cancel you in the media, and if it gets to it, they cancel you in the courtroom.
Let
But
me, let,
go
let
ahead.
me jump in here. Remember last week or the week before, I was talking about the Marxist approach to racism, and what was that called? Classic racism or something else? And the term, but you said something that triggered, and that was equality. And I don't think the Constitution or the world in general thinks we ought to have equality. What we ought to have is equity, because people are not equal, no matter how you put it.
Well, I think in that context, I understand what you're saying. But I think in the context of legalese, jurisprudence, equality under the law means that no matter who you are, if you reside in the United States, you should be equal under the law, that the law shouldn't apply differently to elites than it does to the average Joe on the street, so to speak.
Well, I agree, but I think the language has changed over time. And I honestly think that trying to achieve equity is more accurate than trying to achieve equality. Because if we're all going to be equal, quote unquote, then we're all going to have, a chicken in every pot, a car in every garage, and that's just not going to happen.
Yeah, no, I'm not. Well, I'm glad you brought the point up, because some people might be thinking or construing that that's a direction I'm going in, or that Mark Stein, I should say, was going in, and that's not at all. He was talking about the fact that if somebody does something or is involved in something that the left wants to seize upon and oftentimes mischaracterize, and then the press joins in, they're basically tried and convicted before they even get into a courtroom. And again, I think one of the good examples today is if there's a shooting involving a police officer, the wolves come out of the forest, and the pack is ready to devour the police officer. And that's not to say that, I'm not one to say that there's never justification for condemning the actions of, I use the term, a rogue police officer. But I think oftentimes, the good guys, the good men and women that defend and protect us, are susceptible to the outcry of the left and its minions in the press and the mainstream media.
Well, we have a case here. In fact, we have several cases. One is a young man, teenager, I believe, who was shot trying to run down police in a stolen car, and everybody's really upset, even though he has a rap sheet that's a mile long. Then we have another one where a South African was shot, and you got two perspectives. You know, there's the family who thought they were being attacked, and there's this language barrier and everything else. South Africa's all involved now. And you know, it's absolutely incredible. Now the prosecutor is involved, who I happen to like. He's a former judge. And he's not going to release the body cam tapes because they might have to go to trial with it. Of course, everybody's just going, oh no, they're not being transparent. But they don't understand the way the system works.
Well, there's another one, and I can't recall the state it occurred in. For some reason, I'm thinking North or South Carolina, but I could be wrong. But it involved a female wielding a knife attacking another female, and an officer shot the knife wielding woman.
Oh yes, I remember.
And, you know, all the civil rights activists, which I think we all know who they are, come out of the woodwork. And, you know, the guy is, the officer, I should say, is deemed guilty. And in their minds, the burden is on the officer and the officer's attorney to prove his innocence. And I'm not suggesting, and I don't think Mark Stein is, that this sort of thing hasn't happened until recent times, but it certainly hasn't happened with the magnitude or the pervasiveness that you see in the country now. And we are supposed to be a nation of laws, not of men. And I think if we were to take a reliable poll with a reliable sampling, statistical sampling of Americans, I think they would say that there's an erosion of law and order, an erosion of respect for the law, and that any of us, including you and I, Dick, could suddenly find ourselves in a world of hurt on something that we were perceived to have done. And if it crossed the line with the radical left in this country, they have forces in politics, the media, academia. I mean, I use the analogy of the wolf pack, but my goodness, when they descend on you, I recall the young man, Sandeman, I believe his name was, from Northern Kentucky, who was at the rally in Washington, D.C. And that Indian beating on his drum, kind of getting in the young man's face. Turned out he was a political activist, a long-standing political activist, and also had a rap sheet. The young man didn't say two words to him, but the media decided that the kid had been disrespectful. And now he and his attorney are suing. I think they're suing the Washington Post. I believe they've settled with CNN. I mean, it turned out that there was a huge overreaction. And by the way, I should also mention Stein did not mention this in particular, but anytime anything happens that crosses the line with leftist thinking, Hollywood comes out of the woodwork. And you get such intellectual giants as Cher and Rob Reiner and Ed Asner and, forgetting a few, but coming out with preposterous statements and using their Twitter feeds like machine guns from a trench. And people are wounded with words, and seldom do you see retractions
Why
in
is
the media.
If we know this is going on, why?
Well, I think two things. One, the left is far better, and I hate this bifurcation of left and right, but I'm going to answer your question this way. The left is far better at taking its agenda not only to the streets, but in the state legislatures and the halls of Congress, and certainly the media, than the right is. I mean, we talked about that, I believe, last week. I call it, or I've read authors who call it the Democratic media complex. What's promulgated in the college and university system, and even now down into the high schools and grade schools. I mean, the left never skips a beat. And the other thing the left doesn't do is they don't believe in compromise. I'm not saying that's a virtue. I'm just saying that's a reality of how they approach things. But the GOP has a few diehard conservative congressmen who are willing to put up a fight, but most seek compromise, thinking they're being high-minded. Rush Limbaugh used to talk about that all the time. He said there's nothing wrong with trying to win the battle of ideas against the left. And yet, at every turn, I mean, Paul Ryan, the former Speaker of the House, is suddenly making a lot of statements. President Bush, in his support of what's happening on the southern border. I mean,
But you've triggered two thoughts in me. Number one, I think a lot of this, when you look at classic racism and everything else, it's basically a resurgence of Marxism. And I think that's what the draw is. People that never read history don't have a clue that there is not a Marxist government that's ever succeeded more than a few years, and they all collapse. That's issue number one. Keep that in your mind. Issue number two, and I just saw the figures again, and it really gets me. You got blacks 3% or so. I don't know the numbers, but basically, you got blacks killed by whites is extremely low. Blacks killed by blacks, extremely high. And these figures go on. Chicago, for example, I mean, they'll have 60 murders over a weekend. And yet that never gets addressed. It's always the white guy did this, the white guy did that. Right now, of course, there's the big push to resurge the history of Greenville, Tulsa. And, everybody, and I must admit it was wrong. I mean, it was terrible. But people are digging all these things up and not looking at the historical perspective. They're applying modern perspectives to it, which I think takes the whole learning point away.
Well,
Off my soapbox.
no, you're right. Black on black crime is a real issue. And I think we know a lot of the reasons for that. And the Democrats don't address it. I mean, the mayor of Chicago is an absolute crazy. And I talked about her, I think it was last week, but her big, we had, the shootings every weekend in Chicago, like a third world country. And all she's worried about is keeping white people out of press conferences, white journalists. He says the only journalists that can come to her press conferences now have to be of color. I mean,
Yeah, but white's a color.
I mean, Daley, say what you want about Richard Daley, and God knows there was a lot of corruption in his years running Chicago. He ran a much tighter ship. I mean, Daley, in some respects, I don't want to be misquoted here, but in some respects was, the Democratic Party's answer to say how Rudy Giuliani cleaned up New York.
Okay, you triggered another thought. You're talking about what's going on the border.
Well, that,
And I think I mentioned it once before with Trump's policies and everything else. People forget in the 50s, Eisenhower had Project Wetback,
right.
which was similar to Trump's, and it worked. Now, given the historical perspective of, first of all, if you do something and it doesn't work and you do it again, it's probably not going to work. If you find something that worked, you can massage it, change it, whatever, and you can come up with something that works. But what I don't understand is how we've got this goat rope going along the border and with the police and everything else, and we can't seem to figure out anything that makes any progress.
Well, I know you haven't had an opportunity yet to read this speech by Mark Stein, but I mentioned there were 3 key things he talked about, and equality under the law was item 1. Number 2, you just hit on. When he says that America is becoming unrecognizable, he says that the southern border is a sieve. The Biden administration basically reversed everything Donald Trump did to secure the southern border. And he says, as absurd as it may sound, Biden's policy essentially says anybody and everybody who wants to come to the United States ought to be able to come to the United States. And if they end up coming to the United States by crossing the Rio Grande, so be it. And, let's take it to its extreme. I think the number is something like 6 billion people in the world today. Back out the population of the United States, if all the peoples of the world wanted to come to up through Mexico, cross the Rio Grande, and come to the United States, I think Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, the Democratic establishment, the corporations that go along with the preposterous policy, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they're all for it. And that, to whatever degree it does occur, obliterates the U.S. It obliterates and now I'm borrowing from a radio talk show host and podcaster, Michael Savage, but he's for decades has talked about language, borders, and culture. And when you just open up your borders and let anybody and everyone in, you're just asking that our language, our borders, and our culture be obliterated. And it is happening as we speak. And what country does that? And the thing that Stein hits on, he says, for over a year, because of the COVID pandemic, which the Democrats leveraged the hell out of, they sought to control our every movement. You know, stay in your homes, work from home, wear masks. You can't have gatherings of more than family members. You can't go to church. Even peaceful assemblies were not allowed. Now, you could riot in the streets without social distancing. BLM and Antifa were allowed to do that, particularly in Democratic cities all across the country. I mean, think about Seattle, think about Portland, think about Minneapolis. I don't think, you know, there were countless examples. I mean, all the COVID restrictions went out the window because the leftists and their minions in the US government were all about creating chaos and rioting and looting. So, but for John Q. Citizen, for Dick and Bernie and other families, our Bill of Rights were taken away.
Well, you know, I know you're sensitive about
And
that.
well, and let me make one last comment, and it's Mark Stein's comment. He said, so having just gone through, we'll call it a year, where we literally had to batten down the hatches, our Bill of Rights went out the window, or at least were put in abeyance, and our freedom of movement was very much constricted. Now, and by the way, those restrictions haven't been lifted in many of the Democratic states. They still exist, but come one, come all across the southern border. No testing, no requirement to be vaccinated. Doesn't matter what disease you have. I mean, is anybody standing, and I'm being a smartass here, but is anybody standing along the Rio Grande to make sure that when they cross, they're maintaining social distancing? Now, I'm saying that, you know, tongue in cheek.
Well,
But nobody cares about restrictions to protect American citizens from people who carry the disease coming into the country, let alone they want to come here and milk American taxpayers. But just from the perspective of a pandemic, it's a complete contradiction of what we've all American citizens have just gone through for a year now.
okay, but we're running out of time, but you triggered three more points. And that is, you know, I disagree with your comments on the Bill of Rights or whatever, but that doesn't matter. Some of the most draconian measures were used here in the state of Hawaii. And in the last 2 weeks alone, we've gone from 134 cases a day, which was already going down, to 23. So vaccination is working. Free testing before people come in is working. But getting away from that, you know, the only thing I can see why the Democrats like this surge is it gets them voters. That's the only gain that I see.
I couldn't agree more. And by the way, it gives them voters who will be compliant in terms of the leftist agenda and feeling that they're beholden to the Democratic Party. Because Biden basically announced, if I win, come one, come all. And a lot of them were crossing, wearing Biden t-shirts. And by the way, and now I'm borrowing from Michael Savage, who's written books on our immigration system. And I say that, I guess in a pejorative sense. These aren't people who are literate in their own language in their country of origin. These aren't rocket scientists. We're not looking for people who can give America an advantage in terms of our service industry or our industrial might or our scientific and technological expertise. These are just poor people with, and bless their hearts, but with a lot of them with diseases, not just COVID, but other diseases, and they're streaming across the border at will. And once they're here, a lot are saying they're refugees, so to speak. But what they're really doing is they're allowed to come into the country, and I think it's for 3 years. They're waiting for court dates to make the case why they should be allowed to remain permanently. But so many are flooding across the border that court system, that's going to keep pushing out. And we already know from when Trump took over that most of them never appear for their court dates when the court dates do come up.
Okay, we're running out of time, and what I'd like to think about in the future is, we know things are screwed up. How do we fix it? So let's do that.
Okay.